Gertrude Kendrick had lived in Caldwell, Kansas for 38 years, and in all that time, not a single man in town had ever truly looked at her. She was not ugly. She was not peculiar in any way that would make a person recoil or cross the street to avoid her. She had deep brown hair that she kept pinned beneath a worn calico bonnet, and eyes the color of sage brush after rain, a kind of gray-green that caught the light differently depending on the hour. She had strong hands from years of work, and a mouth that curved naturally upward at the corners even when she was not smiling, which gave strangers the occasional impression that she was quietly amused by something they could not see. She was 38 years old, and she had lived in Caldwell since she was born, and she was as much a part of the landscape as the water tower at the edge of Main Street or the old cottonwood that leaned over the dry creek bed. And yet, the men of Caldwell looked through her the way a man looks through a window he has stopped noticing. She carried goods from Haggerty's Mercantile. She swept the front step of the small boarding house she ran on the west side of Maple Street. She sat in the third pew from the back at First Baptist every Sunday, and she brought preserves to the church social every autumn. And every autumn the preserves were eaten and enjoyed, and not one man thought to ask who had made them. It had started when she was young, around 18, when the pretty girls, the ones with yellow curls and fathers who owned land, had occupied every man's attention like bright objects catching sunlight. Gertrude had not been plain, but she had not sparkled in the way that Kansas men expected a girl to sparkle. She had been serious and quiet and more interested in reading the newspapers her father brought back from Wichita than in batting her eyes at cowhands. And so the years had passed, one after the other, like fence posts counted from a moving wagon, and the men of Caldwell had found their wives among the yellow-haired girls, and Gertrude had opened her boarding house when her parents died and left her the house, and she had made herself useful and solvent and thoroughly, completely invisible. By 1883, Caldwell had grown into a proper cattle town. The Kishom Trail had made it loud and dusty and profitable, and every spring the drovers came up from Texas with their longhorns and their sunburned necks and their swagger, and every spring Gertrude watched from her front step as the town swelled and then emptied again, and the men looked right past her as though she were another fence post. She had made a kind of peace with it. That was what she told herself on the mornings when the loneliness pressed hardest, that she had made a peace with it, the way a person makes peace with weather or poor soil. You could not change it. You simply worked around it. The morning Noah Bristol rode into Caldwell was an ordinary Tuesday in late April, and Gertrude was doing what she did every Tuesday morning, hauling water from the pump to the washing tubs in the yard behind the boarding house. She had 3 boarders at that time: a railroad surveyor named Cobb, an older gentleman named Mr. Parris who had come to Caldwell for his lungs and stayed for the dry air, and a young schoolteacher from Missouri who went by Miss Elliott and kept to herself in a way Gertrude quietly admired. 3 boarders was enough to keep the house running, not quite enough to be comfortable, and Gertrude moved through her mornings with the efficient economy of a woman who had learned to stretch everything thin. She was crossing from the pump back to the tubs, a heavy bucket in each hand, when she heard the particular sound of a horse coming down Main Street at a walk, not the frantic clatter of a cowhand arriving with cattle, not the decisive thud of a lawman on official business, but something slower and more deliberate, the sound of a man who was looking at a town for the first time and deciding what he thought of it. Gertrude set her buckets down at the side of the house and wiped her hands on her apron and looked. The man on the bay horse was perhaps 40 or close to it. It was hard to say from across the street. He sat the saddle in a way that suggested he had spent most of his adult life on horseback, but there was something in his posture that was different from a cowhand's loose slouch. He was upright, careful. His hat was a good quality brown felt, trail-worn but not battered, and he wore a canvas duster that had been road gray for long enough that it had given up remembering its original color. He had a lean face and dark eyes and a jaw that needed a razor's attention, and he was looking at the buildings of Caldwell with the particular attentiveness of a man who was reading something important. Gertrude watched him the way she watched most things, quietly, from a slight remove, cataloging details the way a person catalogs the weather. Then the man on the bay horse turned his head, and across the full width of Main Street, his eyes found hers. Not the vague, sliding glance of a stranger's gaze, landing briefly on a person and moving on. He looked at her directly and fully, the way a person looks at something they recognize but cannot quite place, with a focus that was curious and certain at the same time. He held her gaze for a full breath, 2 full breaths, and then he touched the brim of his hat in a slow, deliberate acknowledgement, and something in Gertrude's chest did a thing it had not done in so long that she nearly did not recognize the feeling. She picked up her buckets and went back to her washing. But her hands were not entirely steady, and she was not entirely sure why. Noah Bristol had come to Caldwell because he was looking for a man named Delacroix, and because Caldwell was the kind of town where men who needed to disappear sometimes came, drawn by the cattle traffic and the transient nature of a drover's town where no one was expected to be permanent. He had been traveling for 3 weeks out of Dodge City, following a trail that had gone cold twice and been picked up again by patience, and the willingness to ask questions in saloons. He was not a lawman. He had been, once in another life, a deputy in a Colorado mining town for 2 years before the mine closed, and the town dissolved, and there was nothing left to be a deputy of. Now he worked as a private agent, employed by a cattle outfit called the Meridian Land Company out of Abilene, who had been robbed of a considerable payroll 6 weeks ago and wanted it back without the attendant drama of involving federal authorities. It was the kind of work that suited his particular skills, which were mostly patience and observation, and it paid well enough to keep him moving from town to town without growing roots anywhere. He had not expected to arrive in Caldwell and have someone look at him the way that woman had looked at him from across the street. It was not a dramatic look. She had not stared or made any display. But she had looked at him with an intelligence and a directness that he was not accustomed to finding in passing glances, and when he had touched his hat in acknowledgement, she had held herself very still for a moment before turning away, and something about that stillness had stayed with him as he continued down Main Street toward the livery. He got his horse settled at the livery, negotiated a reasonable rate, and walked the length of Main Street taking inventory. There was a hotel, the Cattleman's Rest, 2 stories, paint peeling at the corners. A saloon, the Long Branch, which was the only establishment that seemed to be doing brisk business at 10 in the morning. Haggerty's Mercantile. A barber, a dry goods establishment, a small newspaper office with a hand-lettered sign that read Caldwell Courier, a doctor's office, a land office, and at the far west end of the main road, set back slightly from the street, a 2-story frame house with a sign on the gate that read Kendrick Boarding House, clean rooms, reasonable rates, inquire within. He stood at the gate for a moment. Reasonable rates suited him. Clean rooms suited him better. And the woman he had seen from across the street had been coming from the direction of this house, and he was a man who paid attention to things that interested him, and that woman had interested him in a way he could not yet fully articulate. He pushed open the gate. Gertrude heard the gate and dried her hands on her apron for the second time that morning and came around the side of the house to the front, and she found the man from the bay horse standing in her front yard looking at her house with the same careful, reading attention he had given the town. Up close, he was somewhat older than she had guessed, not quite 40, she revised, but close. He had the kind of face that showed the weather it had lived through, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes and a seriousness to his expression that was not unfriendly, only habitual. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black in the morning shade, and he was looking at her again with that same quality of attention that she had felt from across the street. "Good morning," she said, because she was not a woman who waited for others to begin. "Good morning," he said, His voice was quiet and measured, a voice that did not feel the need to fill space. "I saw the sign. I'm looking for a room." "How long?" she asked. "I'm not certain. A week, possibly longer. I can pay a week in advance." She looked at him the way she had learned to look at potential boarders in 20 years of running a house, not with suspicion exactly, but with the calm, practiced assessment of a woman who had twice let rooms to men who turned out to be more trouble than their week's rent was worth. "I have one room available," she said. $1.50 a week. That includes breakfast. Supper is an extra 20 cents. I run a quiet house, Mr. Bristol," he said. "Noah Bristol. Mr. Bristol. I run a quiet house. I'd appreciate it if you kept it that way." "That suits me perfectly," he said, and she believed him because there was nothing in his manner that suggested a man who enjoyed noise. "Come in then," she said. "I'll show you the room." The room she showed him was the one at the back of the second floor, which caught the afternoon light and looked out over the small kitchen garden she kept. It was clean and simply furnished: an iron bedstead, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a small writing desk, a straight-backed chair, a rag rug on the plank floor. He looked around it with what she had already begun to recognize as his characteristic thoroughness. "It's a good room," he said. "It is," she agreed, because it was, and she had never seen any reason to pretend otherwise. He paid her the week in advance, pulled the coins from a leather purse that looked well used, and she showed him where the privy was and where he could wash up and what time breakfast was served. And then she left him to settle in and went back to her washing with the deliberate intention of not thinking about him at all. She thought about him the entire afternoon. It was not, she told herself firmly, anything particular about the man himself. It was simply the novelty of being looked at. In 20 years of running this house, in 38 years of living in this town, she had become so thoroughly accustomed to being unseen that the simple act of a man making direct eye contact with her and holding it for 2 full breaths felt remarkable. That was all it was. Novelty. She was not a foolish woman. She was not a woman who built castles out of a stranger touching the brim of his hat. But that evening at supper, when Mr. Bristol came down from his room and took the empty seat at the long table, and when Mr. Cobb talked exclusively about railroad grades, and Miss Elliott talked exclusively about her third-grade pupils, and Mr. Paris dozed slightly between the soup and the bread, Noah Bristol ate his supper and listened to all of them with that same quality of genuine attention. And 3 times during the meal his eyes moved to Gertrude at the head of the table, not the quick, unseeing glances of a man whose gaze happens to pass over a surface, but the careful, deliberate look of someone paying attention. The 3rd time it happened, Gertrude found that she had stopped breathing for a moment, and she was extremely annoyed with herself about it. After supper, when the boarders had dispersed to their rooms and Gertrude was clearing the dishes, she heard a knock at the kitchen doorway. She turned to find Mr. Bristol standing there with his supper plate in his hand. "I can bring my plate in," he said simply. She stared at him. In 20 years no boarder had ever brought his plate in. She had not known until that precise moment that this had been something she had quietly wanted. She recovered herself quickly. "You can set it on the sideboard," she said. He set it on the sideboard and did not leave. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the quietness she was beginning to associate with him as naturally as she associated the smell of pine sap with the mountains, and he said, "This is a good house, Miss Kendrick." "Mrs. Kendrick," she said, and then immediately corrected herself because she had been correcting herself for the same reason for 15 years, ever since she had started calling herself Mrs. to make the boarding house seem more respectable, a habit that was now so ingrained that she sometimes forgot it was not true. "Actually, it's Miss. I've kept the Mrs. for professional reasons." He considered this without any judgment. "Miss Kendrick, then," he said. "It's a good house." "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and the fact that she meant it surprised her a little. "The garden out back," he said. "You grow it yourself." "Every square inch of it," she said. "What's coming up now?" She told him about the early spring onions and the kale that had survived the last frost and the carrots she had started indoors. and was hoping to get into the ground by the end of the week. She told him this with the small, specific pleasure of a person discussing something they love with someone who seems to actually want to hear it. And he listened with the same intent quiet he brought to everything, and asked one or two questions that showed he understood what she was talking about. And after perhaps 10 minutes, he said good night and went upstairs, and Gertrude finished washing the dishes with her mind full of noise. The next morning at breakfast, she learned a few things about Noah Bristol, not because he offered much, but because he responded honestly when spoken to, and because Gertrude was a good listener with 20 years of practice at understanding people from small details. She learned that he had grown up in Ohio but had come west at 22. She learned that he had been in Colorado, in Wyoming, in the Indian Territory. She learned that he had no family he was in immediate contact with and did not offer to explain why, and she did not ask. She learned that he drank his coffee black and ate everything on his plate and was polite to Miss Elliot and patient with Mr. Parris's tendency to repeat himself, and that he had a horse named Calhoun that he was clearly fond of. She also learned, by watching him throughout the day, that he was in Caldwell for a purpose beyond rest. He left the boarding house mid-morning and was gone for several hours, and when he returned for supper, he had the particular quietness of a man who has spent the day asking questions and listening to answers. He carried no badge, but he carried himself like a man with a task. She did not ask about it. It was not her business. What she noticed instead, and tried not to notice, was that every time Noah Bristol looked at her, it was with the same quality of focus, unhurried, clear, genuinely interested. Not the way a man looks at a woman he is assessing for attractiveness, making the brief calculation that men often make and then moving on. Something different from that. He looked at her as though she were interesting to him in a way he was still in the process of understanding. She had never once in her life been looked at that way, and it was doing something very inconvenient to her internal equilibrium. On the third day, he found her in the garden. She was on her knees in the dark April soil, working compost around the base of the onion seedlings with her bare hands, her bonnet pushed back and her sleeves rolled above her elbows, entirely in her element. She heard his step on the path and looked up, and he was standing at the edge of the garden with a mug of coffee, her coffee, from the kitchen stove held out to her. "You left this on the counter," he said. She looked at the mug. She had left it on the counter. She sometimes lost track of her coffee when she got absorbed in the garden. "Thank you," she said, and took it and sat back on her heels and drank it while he crouched down at the edge of the bed and looked at what she was doing with the matter-of-fact interest of someone who grew up around cultivated things. "What kind of compost?" he asked. "Horse and kitchen scraps mostly. I get the horse manure from the livery. Ed Marsh lets me take what I want in exchange for supper on Wednesdays." "Smart arrangement," he said. "I find that most useful things are built on swapped labor," she said. He smiled at that, a small smile, but genuine, that made the lines at the corners of his eyes deepen in a way she found entirely too pleasant. "I think you're probably right about that," he said. They sat in the garden for a while, her working and him watching with a kind of companionable quietness that she could not remember experiencing with anyone in longer than she could easily recall. Eventually he said, "How long have you run this house?" "Since my parents died," she said. "My father went first in '72. My mother the following winter. I was 27. It was either open the house or sell it, and I had nowhere to go and no reason to go anywhere, so I opened the house." "No reason," he repeated, and there was a thoughtfulness in it rather than a challenge. "I was not then, and am not now, a woman with a great many social options," she said, which was more honest than she usually permitted herself to be with anyone, and she was not entirely sure why she was being honest with him. She suspected it was because he seemed constitutionally incapable of being anything other than direct, and it was difficult to dissemble with someone who wasn't. He looked at her steadily. "That seems like it would be other people's loss," he said. She was glad she was looking down at the onion seedlings when he said it, because, Whatever expression crossed her face in that moment was not one she would have wanted him to see. "You're kind," she said, keeping her voice level. "No," he said. "I'm observant. There's a difference." He left her alone in the garden after that, and she stayed on her knees in the dirt for considerably longer than the onions required. The week passed in a manner that Gertrude would have described, if she had been pressed to describe it honestly, as the most unexpectedly rich week she could remember in years. Noah Bristol was not demonstrative. He did not court her in any obvious way. He simply paid attention to her in the steady, unrelenting manner of a man who found her genuinely worth paying attention to. And this simple fact, which would have meant nothing to a woman accustomed to it, was extraordinary to Gertrude in a way she could not have fully explained even to herself. He helped her bring in a load of firewood one morning without being asked, simply picking up the second end of the load when he saw her struggling at the back of the house. He asked her opinion, at supper one evening, about a story in the Caldwell Courier regarding a proposed railway extension, and listened to her response, not with the polite, glazed attention men usually offered women who expressed opinions, but with focused interest, following up with a question that showed he had absorbed what she said. When Mr. Paris had a bad night with his cough and Gertrude was up until past midnight making him a mustard poultice, Noah came downstairs at some point and sat quietly in the hall with a lamp while she worked, not offering to help with anything that was not his to help with, simply present in case. At the end of the week, she half expected him to pay and leave. Instead, he paid for a second week without any discussion and went upstairs to his room, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long moment with the coins in her hand before she put them in the tin she kept in the cupboard. She had a conversation with herself that night, lying in her bed in the dark listening to the sounds of Caldwell settling into its late hours, the distant noise from the Long Branch, the occasional sound of cattle from the pens at the edge of town, the April wind at the window. She was 38 years old. She had been invisible to every man she had ever known for 20 years. This man, who had been in her house for a week and who would likely be gone in another week, had looked at her with more genuine attention than she had been shown in 2 decades. She was not a young woman. She was not a woman with illusions about her romantic prospects. She was a sensible, hard-working woman who ran a clean house and grew a good garden and had made her peace with her life. She should not be lying awake thinking about the way a man's eyes crinkled when he smiled. She should absolutely not be doing that. She did it anyway, because some things are simply beyond the reach of sensibility. What Gertrude did not know, because Noah was not the kind of man who made declarations before he was certain of something, was that he was also lying awake in the back room of the second floor, looking at the ceiling with the particular sleeplessness of a man who is recognizing something about himself that he had not expected to recognize. He was in Caldwell for Delacroix. He had not come to Caldwell for any other reason. He had a job to finish, and he was good at his job, and the job had never before been complicated by anything personal. He had lived a life that moved from town to town, from one task to the next, and a moving life was not compatible with the kind of person you needed to be for another person, which was why he had stopped trying to be that person some years ago, after a woman in Cheyenne named Catherine had told him, not unkindly, that loving him was like loving a river because he was always somewhere else. He had thought she was right. He had thought it was simply his nature. He was not certain of that anymore, and the uncertainty had arrived unexpectedly and without particular warning, and had Gertrude Kendrick's gray-green eyes. He found Delacroix on the 9th day of his stay in Caldwell. The man had been living under a different name in a rented room above the Long Branch saloon, and he had become sloppy with his habits in the way that men become sloppy when they believe they have successfully disappeared. Noah had been patient and careful, and on the 9th morning he had his evidence: a letter, testimony from the Long Branch bartender, and the recovered portion of the Meridian payroll that Delacroix had been slowly spending on whiskey and poker. He sent word to the Meridian Land Company agent in Wichita, arranged for the town marshal, a competent man named Amos Garrett who took his job seriously, to take Delacroix into custody pending transport to federal court in Topeka, and stood in the street outside the Long Branch in the late morning light, feeling the particular deflation that came at the end of a task that had occupied his attention entirely. The task was done. He could leave. He went to Haggerty's Mercantile and bought a new pencil and a small notebook, because he had filled the previous one, and then he stood on the sidewalk outside Haggerty's in the April sunlight and looked down Main Street toward the West End, where he could just make out the sign on the gate of the Kendrick boarding house. He was aware that he was manufacturing a reason to stay, which was not something he had done before. He was aware that it was because of a woman, which was something he had not let himself do in quite some time. He was aware that she was a remarkable person, and that he had known her for 9 days, and that 9 days was not very long, except that it was sometimes enough. He went back to the boarding house at noon and found Gertrude in the kitchen making bread, her hands deep in dough, flour on her cheek, and she looked up when he came in with that expression. She had the one that was not quite a smile but was warmer than a neutral face, and said, "You're back early." "I finished what I came to do," he said. She kept working the dough. "I see," she said, and her voice was perfectly level, and he could not read what was underneath it because she was very good at keeping things underneath. "I thought I might stay on a few more days," he said, "if the room's available." She looked at him then, not a quick look but a full one, the kind that took inventory. "The room is available," she said. "Good," he said. "Did you get what you needed?" she asked. "In town?" "Yes," he said. "There was a man I was looking for. I found him." She nodded and returned to her bread. "Lawman's work?" "Not exactly. I work for a private concern, something between a detective and a scout, I suppose." "I thought it was something like that," she said. "Did you?" "You have the look of a man with a purpose," she said. "And you've been asking questions around town. Ed Marsh mentioned it. He said you'd been asking about some of the transient men who passed through." Noah was somewhat impressed, and he let it show. "You're well connected." "When you're invisible you hear things," she said, and then stopped as though she had said more than she intended. He was quiet for a moment. "Invisible," he repeated. She did not look up. "It's just an expression." "Is it?" he said gently. She pushed the dough with more force than it probably needed. "Mr. Bristol, I have lived in this town for 38 years, and I am on the far side of the age where men in Kansas take notice of a woman. I am not complaining about it. I am simply explaining that I tend to hear what goes on, because people say things near me that they would not say near someone they were watching." He was standing at the kitchen table now, and he pulled out a chair and sat down, which was something her boarders did not generally do in the kitchen, and he said, "I notice you." The kitchen went very quiet. Even the small sounds of the house seemed to pause. Gertrude set her hands flat against the dough and was still for a moment, and then she said, with her back partly to him, "I am aware of that." "Does it bother you?" he asked. She turned her head to look at him, and her expression was complicated, uncertain, and honest, and a little bit frightened in a way that was completely at odds with the composed, capable woman she presented to the world. "No," she said, "it doesn't bother me." "That's rather the problem." He looked at her with all of his considerable capacity for attention focused entirely on her, and he said, "I don't think it's a problem." "Mr. Bristol," she said, "you will be leaving Caldwell in a matter of days, and I will remain here, and I am too old to be, I am too sensible to read things into what is simply common courtesy." "Common courtesy doesn't usually make a man lose sleep," he said. That stopped her. She turned all the way around, floury hands and all, and looked at him with wide eyes, and he held her gaze steadily, because he was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and he had found that pretending not to feel things you felt was simply a way of wasting time that could be better used. "You should know," she said, after a long pause in which she seemed to be having an internal conversation at some speed, "that I am a practical woman. I am not given to romantic notions. I have run this house alone for 11 years, and I have managed perfectly well, and I am not a woman who falls apart over a kind word." "I know that," he said. It's part of what I find so, he paused, choosing the word. Compelling. She stared at him for another moment, and then she turned back to her bread and said, in a voice that was only very slightly unsteady, "Go read your newspaper, Mr. Bristol. I have bread to finish." He went and read his newspaper, but he was smiling as he went, which was something he did not do lightly. That evening, after supper and after the other boarders had gone upstairs, Gertrude brought 2 cups of coffee to the small parlor off the front room, which she rarely used herself, and she set one on the side table near where Noah was sitting reading, and she sat in the chair across from him with her own cup and her mending basket, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was the most comfortable silence Gertrude had sat in since she could not remember when. "Tell me about Ohio," she said eventually. He looked up from his book. "What about it?" "Whatever you want to tell me." He thought for a moment, the way he thought about everything carefully without rushing. "My father had a farm east of Columbus," he said. "Corn and wheat, it was good land. He worked hard for it." A pause. "I was not cut out for farming. I think he knew it before I did. He never said so, but when I told him at 21 that I was going west, he helped me pack." "Did you miss it?" "The farm? No, I missed him." A different pause, shorter and denser. "He died in 78. I got back for the funeral, but just barely." She heard the weight in that and did not try to lessen it with platitudes. "I'm sorry," she said simply, which was what the situation called for. "Your parents," he said, returning the inquiry with the natural reciprocity of a conversation between 2 people who were genuinely interested in each other. "You said your father went first." "In the spring. He had a growth. He was ready, I think, by the end. He'd made peace with the Lord and with the land and with most of his debts." She turned her mending over in her hands. "My mother was harder. She didn't want to go. She had opinions about everything right up until the last week, and I think dying felt to her like an interruption." Noah smiled at that, the real smile she had already learned to look for. "You sound like her." "I imagine I am," Gertrude said. She always said I had her stubbornness and my father's sense, which she intended as a compliment to my sense and a warning about the stubbornness. Was she right? About the stubbornness? Entirely. They sat and talked and mended. Well, she mended and he read, though the book was open in his lap more than it was in front of his eyes, until the lamp needed trimming, and then she trimmed it and said it was getting late, and he agreed. And at the foot of the stairs, he said good night in a voice that was warm in a way she was beginning to hoard like something rare and finite. She lay awake again that night, but this time it was not the helpless, restless sleeplessness of a woman who does not know what she is feeling. She knew perfectly well what she was feeling. She was simply negotiating with the wiser, more cautious part of herself about what to do about it. The wiser, more cautious part of herself made some excellent points. He traveled. He had no home. She had a home that could not move. She was 38, past the age that the world considered marriageable. And she had spent 20 years learning not to want things she could not have. And she was very good at it. And it would be entirely foolish to unlearn it now for a man who had been in her house for 9 days. The other part of herself, the part that had read every penny novel that passed through Caldwell for 38 years, and had kept a very particular kind of hope bundled small and tight in some interior corner, said that she was 38, not dead, and that being sensible was admirable, but that there were limits to how long a person should spend being sensible at the expense of being alive. She did not resolve the negotiation that night. In the morning she made biscuits and fried salt pork and thought about what she was doing with a concentration she usually reserved for financial ledgers. And when Noah came down for breakfast and said good morning in his quiet, direct way, she said good morning back and poured his coffee and told herself that she was going to be sensible and measured and not read anything into anything. And then he said, "What are you thinking about?" And she said, without planning to, "You, actually." The words sat between them like something dropped. Noah set down his coffee mug and looked at her across the kitchen table with those dark eyes and said, perfectly calmly, "Good. That evens the score somewhat." She laughed. She was not expecting to laugh, and it came out genuine and unguarded, and the startled pleasure of it was visible on her face for a full moment before she caught herself. And when she looked at him again, he was looking at her with an expression so open and warm that it made something ache behind her breastbone. "Mr. Bristol," she said. "Noah," he said. She looked at him. "Noah," she said, and the name in her mouth was strange and new and right in the way a key is right when it fits the lock it was made for. "What are you doing?" "I'm having breakfast," he said. "You know what I mean." He was quiet for a moment, then said with his characteristic directness, "I'm paying attention to a woman who should have been paid attention to a long time ago, and I'm doing it because she is the most genuinely interesting person I have met in longer than I care to calculate, and because when I rode into this town I looked across the street and saw her standing there, and I have not managed to stop thinking about her since." Gertrude was very still. "That is not common courtesy," she said at last. "No," he agreed, "it is not. And you travel," she said. "You have no fixed place." "That has been true," he said carefully. "It is not necessarily a permanent condition." She looked at him with the full force of her gray-green eyes, which were, he had come to think, the most honest eyes he had ever met. "You have known me 10 days," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not proposing to run off to the justice of the peace this afternoon. I'm suggesting that I would like to know you better, and that to do that I would need to stay in Caldwell for a while, and that I am prepared to do that if you are willing to have me." "Stay in Caldwell," she said slowly. "To what end?" "To see," he said. "To find out what happens when I stop leaving before anything has time to grow." She absorbed this for a long moment. Then she said, "I will tell you something, Noah Bristol. I have lived in this town for 38 years, and I have been, as I said, invisible to every man in it for the better part of 20 years, and I have made my peace with that, or I believed I had. And then you rode down Main Street and looked at me across the street as though I was simply a person worth looking at, and I have not known what to do with that since Tuesday." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "I'm simply telling you what's true." She pressed her lips together and looked out the kitchen window at the April morning and the garden she had made from hard soil and patience, and then she looked back at him and said, "You may call me Gertrude." He looked at her with warmth that was so genuine and uncomplicated that it did not know what to do with itself. "Gertrude," he said, and the name in his mouth was the same kind of thing that hers had been in hers, and she knew in that instant with the clarity of a woman who has spent a lifetime being clear-eyed about everything that she was going to fall in love with this man, if she was not already falling. She was already falling. She put more biscuits on his plate and refilled his coffee and told herself to be slow and careful, and she was slow and careful, because she was Gertrude Kendrick, and she had not been any other way in 38 years. He stayed. He went to Wichita at the end of the second week to file his report with the Meridian Land Company agent and collect his payment, and he was gone for 4 days. And those 4 days were the longest 4 days Gertrude had experienced in quite some time, which told her something about the state of her heart that she was reluctantly beginning to accept. He came back on a Thursday evening in early May with saddlebags that were heavier than they had been when he left, and he brought her a packet of seed catalogs from a seed merchant in Wichita, a whole packet of them, different varieties, carefully chosen, with pages marked where there were things he thought she might find interesting. She stood in the front room holding the catalogs and felt something so acute and simple that she nearly had to sit down. "You thought of my garden," she said. "I thought of you," he said. The garden was a logical extension. She looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway of the front room with his trail dust still on him, looking at her with that complete, unhurried attention, and she thought for perhaps the first time in 20 years of being looked through, "I am seen. This man sees me." She crossed the room. She stood close enough that she had to look up at him, which meant looking up a fair distance because he was tall, and she said, quietly and with the deliberation of a woman who means what she says, "Thank you, Noah." He reached out and took her hand simply, and held it for a moment, and the warmth of his hand around hers was so matter-of-fact and so right that she felt her throat tighten. "I thought about you the whole time I was gone," he said. "I want you to know that. "I thought about you too," she said. "I want you to know that also." They stood in the front room in the early May evening with the light fading through the front windows and the sounds of Caldwell settling into its evening rhythms, and he held her hand, and she held his, and it was not dramatic or excessive, and it was exactly what it was. In the weeks that followed, the residents of Caldwell began to notice something they had not particularly expected to see. It was noticed first by Ed Marsh at the livery, who told his wife, who told her sister, who mentioned it to Ida Haggerty at the Mercantile, which was how information traveled in Caldwell more reliably than it traveled through the courier. The strange thing that people noticed was this. There was a man at the Kendrick boarding house who walked down Main Street every morning with Gertrude Kendrick on his arm, not beside her in the casual way of two people going the same direction, on his arm. Deliberately, the way a man accompanies a woman he is with. And the further strange thing that people noticed was that Gertrude Kendrick, who had walked those streets for 38 years in perfect, unremarkable solitude, was smiling. Not the polite, restrained expression she offered the town in the course of her ordinary business, but a real smile, the kind that involved her eyes, that she apparently had been keeping in reserve for quite a long time and was now deploying freely. Ida Haggerty mentioned to her husband that it was about time. Tom Garrett, the marshal's younger brother, said something less charitable in the Long Branch one evening to the effect that it was strange. A woman like that, at her age, making an exhibition. The Long Branch bartender, whose name was Russell and who had known Gertrude Kendrick since childhood and had a particular affection for her, told Tom Garrett that he could keep his opinions to himself, which Tom Garrett resented but ultimately complied with, because Russell was a large man. Gertrude did not know about Tom Garrett's opinion and would not have particularly cared if she had. She was too occupied with something that was happening to her that she could only describe as the sensation of being thought out, as though she had been operating in a winter that she had not fully recognized as winter until the spring came, and now the spring was here and she was aware of every inch of the warmth. Noah had begun, in May, to spend his evenings in the parlor with her in what had become a ritual: 2 chairs, 2 cups of coffee, lamplight, and conversation. They talked about everything. He told her about the places he had been, the mountains of Colorado that made a man feel appropriately small, the flat immensity of the Texas plains, the particular wildness of the Indian Territory, where the rules were different and everything had more edge to it. She told him about books she had read, about the way Caldwell had changed in 20 years, about the differences she had observed in the cattle that came up the Kishom Trail from year to year as the ranches got larger and the longhorns sometimes gave way to other breeds. She had opinions. She had always had opinions. She had simply had very few people who wanted to hear them. Noah wanted to hear all of them. One evening in the second week of May, when the windows were open and the warm Kansas evening smelled of grass and the flowering tree in the yard, he said, "Tell me something about yourself that nobody in Caldwell knows." She considered this seriously. "I read Latin," she said. He stared at her. "You read Latin?" "My father learned it in seminary before he decided he didn't want to be a minister. He taught me. I read it slowly and imperfectly, but I read it." She paused. "The schoolteacher who came through here in '79, Miss Prentice, she was here a year before she went back east. She was the only person I ever told, and she thought I was making it up until I demonstrated it to her, and then she was simply astonished." "I am astonished," he said. "What do you read?" "Cicero mostly, because I have the volume, some Virgil. The Aeneid is very dramatic." She smiled. "I enjoy things that are dramatic." "Do you?" he said with the beginning of that smile. "In literature," she said firmly. "In life I prefer things orderly." He laughed, and the sound of it in the small parlor was so warm and genuine that she felt it as a physical thing. She loved his laugh. She had come to love his laugh the way you love a sound that you have been hearing in some anticipatory place in your mind long before you actually hear it. "Your turn," she said. He thought about it. "I kept a journal for 12 years, he said. "From when I came west until about 6 years ago. I stopped because—" he paused. "Because at a certain point I stopped knowing what I was writing toward. A journal is a record of a life, and I wasn't certain I was building the kind of life that wanted recording. The sadness in that was quiet and deep, and she heard all of it. "Are you certain now?" she asked. He looked at her. "More certain than I have been," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said, "I think you should start again." "Maybe I will," he said. "I'd need something to write about." She colored slightly. "There is always plenty happening in a boarding house," she said primly, and he laughed again, and she pressed her lips together to hold in her own laughter and failed entirely. On the last Saturday of May, Noah asked her if he could take her for a drive. She had not been taken for a drive in, she genuinely could not calculate how long. She said yes, of course, and wore her second-best dress, which was dark blue calico with white at the collar, and she took off the worn calico bonnet and wore the better one, the one with the ribbon. And when she came downstairs, she found him waiting in the front hall with his hat in his hands and a clean shirt, and he looked at her with an expression so simply pleased and warm that she felt it all the way down to the bones. He had hired a small buggy from the livery, and they drove out east of town, away from the noise and dust of the cattle pens, into the broad Kansas prairie, where the grass was coming in green from the spring rains, and the sky was enormous in the way that only the Kansas sky was enormous, like a second country laid on top of the first one. The meadowlarks were singing, and the cottonwoods along the creek bottom were fully leafed and brilliant, and Gertrude sat in the buggy beside Noah Bristol feeling something she had nearly forgotten was available to her, which was simply joy. Not the qualified, modest satisfaction of a thing going well. Not the small, solid pleasure of a task completed. Joy the wide-open, somewhat terrifying kind. "You look happy," he said, which was not a question. "I am," she said. "Good," he said, and took her hand where it rested on the seat between them and held it, and they drove through the Kansas afternoon without saying very much more, because some things do not need elaboration. They stopped at a place where the creek bent around a stand of cottonwoods, and he helped her down from the buggy with a care that was natural rather than performative, and they sat on the creek bank in the shade of the cottonwoods and watched the water move. A red-tailed hawk went over, enormous and unhurried in the blue sky, and she followed it with her eyes until it was gone. "This is beautiful country," he said. "I've passed through it half a dozen times and never properly looked at it." "You have to stop moving to look at things," she said. He turned his head to look at her, and she felt the weight of his gaze on the side of her face. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm beginning to understand that." She turned to look at him, and they were close, sitting on the creek bank, closer than they usually sat, and she could see all the details of his face in the afternoon light, the lines that showed his years, the dark eyes that were always paying attention, the set of his mouth that was serious but capable of so much warmth. "Gertrude," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet, with something in it that was gathering itself. "I told you when I stayed on that I wanted to see what happened when I stopped leaving before things had time to grow," he said. "You did," she said. "I know what's happened," he said. "I'm in love with you. I think I have been for some weeks, and I have been working up to saying it because I wanted to be certain I meant it fully, and I am certain." Gertrude looked at him. She had imagined in the abstract over the years what it might feel like to have a man say those words to her. She had imagined it would be overwhelming in some theatrical way. What it actually was different from that. It was quieter than she had imagined and more solid, like something being placed in her hands that was real and had weight and could be held. "I have never been loved by a man," she said. Her voice was steady. "I want to say that plainly because I want you to understand what this is for me." Not, she hesitated, not pathos, just fact. "I am 38 years old and I have never been courted or loved, or I have lived a solitary life. And you are the first man who has ever—" She paused and took a breath and finished it simply. "I love you, Noah. I am fairly confident I have been loving you since approximately the third day." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he put his arm around her shoulders and drew her gently close, and she let herself lean into him with the sensation of something long-held tension releasing. And they sat on the creek bank in the cottonwood shade with the meadowlarks going and the red-tailed hawks country overhead, and she thought, 20 years. 20 years of being looked through, and this is what was waiting. The summer came on, hot and brilliant and golden, the way Kansas summers are when they are at their best. The cattle traffic swelled through Caldwell through June and July, the Kishom Trail at full noise, drovers from Texas filling the Long Branch and spending their trail pay with the efficient desperation of men who have been on horseback for 3 months. Gertrude's boarding house was full. She had taken on 2 additional temporary boarders, cowhands from a reputable outfit who needed a clean place to stay while their trail boss negotiated the sale of the herd. Noah had, by this time, established himself in Caldwell in a quiet but definite way. He had taken on a small amount of work as an agent for Marshal Garrett, not deputizing, exactly, but assisting in an investigative capacity, the kind of background work that required his particular skills and that Garrett was glad to have and glad to pay for. He had rented a small office space next to the Courier, which gave him a place to work and file his reports, and he paid a fair rent and was respectful to his neighbors, and the town had gradually accepted his presence in the way that towns accept anything that proves itself useful and causes no trouble. What the town could not quite accept, or could not quite agree on, was his relationship with Gertrude Kendrick. There were camps on this question. Ida Haggerty's camp held that it was wonderful about time, and that Gertrude had earned some happiness after all those solitary years. The camp, centered around certain of the longer-established Caldwell families, took the view that a 38-year-old boarding housekeeper was somewhat embarrassing herself by making her feelings visible, and that the stranger would surely leave by fall. There was a third camp, smaller and quieter, that simply wished the 2 of them well and kept their opinions to themselves, which was Gertrude's preferred camp. She knew what was said. She always knew what was said. She had been invisible, but she had not been deaf, and invisibility had its informational advantages. She made her decision about the opinions of Caldwell in the way she made most decisions, with a clear-eyed assessment of what mattered and what did not, and what mattered was this. Noah Bristol looked at her as though she were the most interesting person in his world, and treated her with a regard that was consistent and genuine and not dependent on her performing any version of herself other than the actual one. What the town thought about it was, with respect, their own affair. In August, on a hot evening when the town was loud with late-season cattle business, and the smell of dust and horses was everywhere, Noah appeared at the kitchen door while she was doing the supper dishes and said, "Can we walk?" They walked to the edge of town, past the last buildings and onto the open prairie where the grass was dry and gold in the August evening, and the fireflies were beginning in the creek bottom, and the sky was going through its tremendous Kansas sunset production of orange and pink and deep violet. They walked without hurrying, and she knew by his pace and his quiet that he was thinking towards something important. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and in the last of the sunset light she could see his face clearly, serious and warm and wholly himself. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "I want to know if you would be willing to marry me," he said. "I want to know if you would be willing to build something here in Caldwell with me. I have set down what feel like the beginnings of roots, and I don't want to pull them. I want to stay. But more specifically, I want to stay with you, and I want to do that properly. And I want to ask you now so that you understand I am not, that this is not Noah," she said. "Yes." "Stop talking," she said, and he stopped. She looked at him in the last of the sunset, this man who had ridden down Main Street 6 months ago, and looked at her across a wide street with 2 full breaths of genuine attention. This man who brought her seed catalogs from Wichita and sat in her parlor in the evenings and had said "I love you" on a creek bank in the cottonwood shade, and she said, "Yes, I will marry you." He took her face in both hands with great care, the way a person holds something they are not taking for granted, and he kissed her in the last of the Kansas August sunset, and the fireflies were coming up in the creek bottom, and the prairie grass was gold all around them, and it was exactly right. They were married on the 15th of September, 1883, at the First Baptist Church of Caldwell, by the Reverend Arthur Moody, who had known Gertrude since she was in short skirts, and who conducted the ceremony with evident satisfaction, as though he had personally arranged the whole business and was pleased with how it had turned out. There were not a great many guests. Ed Marsh and his wife. Miss Elliot from the boarding house, who cried quietly throughout. Old Mr. Parris, who had extended his stay without any particular explanation, and who seemed very pleased about the occasion. Marshall Garrett and his wife. Ida Haggerty, who had taken it upon herself to bake the wedding cake without being asked, and had brought it in a great tin-covered dish that required 2 hands to carry. Several of the women from the church ladies' auxiliary, including some who had been in the doubting camp, but had revised their position when they saw the thoroughness of Noah's commitment. Gertrude wore a dress of deep gold wool that she had made herself over the previous 3 weeks, which was not white because she had never been a woman who saw the point of wearing a color that showed every speck of Kansas dust, and which was beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when they are made by someone with skill and care for a purpose that matters to her. She wore her hair down, which she almost never did in public, pinned only at the sides, and it was dark and thick still, with the first threads of gray that she had stopped lamenting some years ago. Noah wore his best suit, which he had purchased in Wichita on his most recent trip there, and he stood at the front of the church with an expression of such quiet, evident happiness that Ida Haggerty had to use her handkerchief twice. When the Reverend Moody got to the part about whether anyone present knew of any reason these two should not be joined in marriage, Tom Garrett opened his mouth at the back of the church. His older brother, the marshal, put a firm hand on his arm, and Tom Garrett closed his mouth, and the ceremony proceeded without interruption. Gertrude stood at the altar next to Noah Bristol and thought about 38 years and the way time turns, and the way a single set of eyes on a Tuesday morning in April can change the entire shape of a life. And she thought about her mother, who had opinions about everything right up until the last week, and who would have had a great many opinions about this. Most of them good ones she would have pretended were critical. And she thought about her father who had taught her Latin and helped her understand that a quiet life need not be a small one. And then the Reverend said the words that mattered, and Noah said his and she said hers, and he took her hand, and she was Mrs. Gertrude Bristol, which was not a thing she had expected to be at 38, and which was exactly the right thing. The celebration afterward at the boarding house was a warm and cheerful affair. Ida Haggerty's cake was excellent. Mr. Parris gave a rambling but genuinely sweet toast that nobody could fully follow but everyone appreciated. Miss Elliot, who turned out to have an unexpectedly lovely singing voice, sang a hymn at the request of the ladies' auxiliary, and a musician from the Long Branch who happened to be passing played something cheerful on a fiddle. Ed Marsh drank a little too much of the punch and told Noah 3 times that he was a fine man, and Noah thanked him 3 times with genuine patience. Gertrude moved through her own wedding celebration with the sensation of being present in her life in a way she had not been since childhood, fully, completely, with nothing held back or kept under control. She laughed freely. She held Noah's hand when they stood together, and he held hers back with the same matter-of-fact rightness that had characterized everything between them from the beginning. That night, when the guests had gone and the boarding house was quiet and the September sky was full of stars visible from the kitchen garden, she sat on the back step in the moonlight for a few minutes alone, just to breathe, just to feel the shape of the day that had happened. Noah found her there and sat down beside her on the step, close, his shoulder against hers, and they looked at the garden and the moonlit sky. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "More than all right." She looked up at the stars. "I used to sit here some evenings," she said, "alone, And I would think I was not complaining, you understand. I genuinely was not, but I would think, is this what it is? Just this, is this the whole of it? He was listening. And now I think, she said, that it was not the whole of it. It was only the part before the whole of it. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat on the back step of the boarding house in the September moonlight, and the garden smelled of late summer and turned earth, and Caldwell made its ordinary sounds around them, and it was, in its completeness, exactly everything. The following year was the year in which Gertrude Kendrick Bristol began to understand what it meant to share a life rather than simply to conduct one. It was different from what she had expected. She had expected more friction, two adults with established habits, set in their ways, learning to occupy the same space. And there was some of that, small navigations. He had a tendency to leave books open face down, which she found troubling for the spines, and she had a habit of rearranging things in the kitchen that he had just located, which required him to search for things he had already found. But these were small things, and they found their way around them with the good humor of two people who understood that the other person was worth a small inconvenience. What she had not expected was how much easier everything became with two. Not just the practical things, though those were real, having a second set of hands for the boarding house, someone who could handle the difficult conversation when a boarder was late on his rent, someone who noticed when she was tired before she admitted it to herself. But deeper than that, the weight of the solitary life she had carried for so long was something she had thought of as simply the weight of life, unavoidable and fixed. She had not understood, until it lifted, that it was something she had been carrying that did not belong to her alone. She told him this one morning at breakfast in November when the first serious cold had come to Caldwell and the light was slant and gray through the kitchen windows, and he listened with his full attention and then said, "I spent 15 years thinking a moving life was the only life I was suited for. I was wrong. I was just waiting for a reason to stop." "Am I a good enough reason?" she asked. "You are the best reason I have ever encountered," he said, which was not flowery or excessive, and was exactly what she needed to hear. Noah's investigative work had grown beyond what he had initially expected. He had taken on 2 cases in the fall, one for the Meridian Company again, one for a land office in Wichita that had been dealing with fraudulent property claims, and he was building a reputation in the region as a man who was thorough and honest and got results without making more trouble than was necessary. He had the beginnings of a small practice, which was what Gertrude called it, because it pleased her to give it that name, and which he had begun to think of seriously as the shape of a livelihood that could sustain a life in one place. He did not leave Caldwell again for more than a week at a stretch. He did not go without telling her exactly where he was going and when he expected to be back. He came back when he said he would. These were not small things. In the spring of 1885, Gertrude told Noah that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, early morning, before the boarders were awake, with the kind of deliberate quietness of a woman who was not entirely certain how to hold the enormity of what she was saying. She was 40 years old. She had never expected this. She had, privately, given up expecting it so many years ago that its arrival felt both miraculous and terrifying. Noah sat across the kitchen table from her and was very still for a moment, not a troubled stillness, but the stillness of a man absorbing something important, and then he stood up and came around the table and took her hands in his, and she looked up at him, and his eyes were bright. "Gertrude," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it is at my age, Gertrude," he said again, more firmly. "It is the most wonderful thing you have ever told me, and you have told me many wonderful things." She felt her eyes fill, which she had not been expecting because she was not a woman who cried easily, and she blinked fiercely and said, "I am not crying." And he said, "I know," and held her hands, and she was a little, and he held her hands through it, and she did not feel foolish. She was 40 years old, and she was going to have a child, and her husband was holding her hands in the morning kitchen and looking at her as though she had given him the world. The boarding house kept running through her pregnancy, because Gertrude was not a woman who stopped working without very good reason, and a pregnancy, she determined, was not sufficient reason to stop what was functioning perfectly well, only reason to be somewhat more careful about the heavy lifting. Noah took over the water hauling without any discussion, and with the efficiency of a man who had decided what was his to do and was doing it. Miss Elliot, who had remained a boarder and had become something close to a friend, helped with the morning breakfast on the days when Gertrude was not feeling well, which Gertrude accepted with better grace than she would have expected of herself, because one of the things love had taught her was how to accept help. The women of Caldwell were, in general, extremely interested in Gertrude's condition. Ida Haggerty knitted a blanket, which arrived in September and was very soft. Reverend Moody's wife brought a covered dish of stew every other week with the reliability of a postal service. Even some of the women who had previously been in the doubting camp had migrated toward something warmer, because a baby has a way of resolving social ambiguities. On a cold November morning in 1885, Gertrude Bristol gave birth to a boy. He was solid and loud and furiously pink, and he announced his arrival into the world with a conviction that Gertrude recognized immediately as very much his own. She had always heard that mothers saw themselves in their babies. What she saw in her son was Noah, the set of the jaw, the dark eyes that blinked fiercely at the light, and she also saw something entirely new and individual, which she understood was the other remarkable thing about children, that they are nothing that existed before. Noah was in the room. He had refused with gentle but unshakable firmness to be anywhere else, and the doctor had acceded with the pragmatic grace of a man who understood when a determination was genuine. He held his son for the first time with the same careful, total attention with which he held everything that mattered, and looked down at the baby with an expression so open and unguarded that Gertrude, exhausted and magnificent in her bed, began to cry again for the second time in her adult life. They named him William, for Noah's father. William Bristol grew up in the Kendrick boarding house on Maple Street, which ceased to be just a boarding house and became, as the years passed, something more like the center of its own small world. He grew up in the garden where his mother taught him the names of every plant, and in the kitchen where the smell of bread was as constant as the smell of morning, and at the supper table where conversation was valued and opinions were expected to be thought through. He grew up watching his father work at the small desk in the office next to the courier, and he grew up knowing without question that his parents found each other endlessly interesting, which was perhaps the most useful thing a child can be raised knowing about love. In the spring of 1888, when William was 2.5, Gertrude told Noah she was expecting again. She was 43, and she told him with the complex mixture of joy and trepidation that the news warranted, and he held her hands again in the morning kitchen and looked at her the same way he had the first time and said the same thing. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever told him. This time it was a daughter. They named her Frances, not for anyone in particular, but because Gertrude had always liked the name and had never had occasion to use it, and now she did. Frances was smaller and quieter than William had been, and she arrived with a composed self-possession that her mother recognized immediately as the Kendrick disposition, and she had her mother's gray-green eyes, which were the color of sage brush after rain. The boarding house, by the late 1880s, had changed in character. They had reduced the number of rooms to let as the family had grown, keeping only 2 rooms available for long-term boarders rather than the 3 or 4 Gertrude had maintained in her solitary years. The income from Noah's work had made this possible. He was well established now, with a regional reputation, and was careful and successful at what he did. The garden had expanded into the lot next door, which Noah had purchased when it came available, and Gertrude grew things in it with an ambition that would have seemed impractical to her 20 years earlier, but felt simply possible now. In 1889, the territory to the south opened for settlement, the Oklahoma Land Rush, the great and complicated event that brought 50,000 people thundering across a boundary line in a single day, staking claims with the extraordinary energy of people who believed in beginnings. Caldwell, as one of the staging towns for the run, was transformed overnight into something barely recognizable, packed with people, overwhelmed, vibrating with a kind of electric desperation. Gertrude watched it from the front step of her boarding house with William on her hip and Frances toddling at her feet and Noah standing beside her, and she felt the enormous weight of history passing through. She thought about the injustice of it, too. The land that the runs opened had not been empty. It had belonged to the tribes who had been placed there, removed from their own places to this place, and now being moved again or hemmed further, their country shrinking in the name of settlement. She had read the accounts in the Courier carefully, and she had discussed them with Noah late at night when the children were asleep, and they had agreed that the great American project of expansion was built on a series of takings that the nation had not yet found a way to honestly account for, and that this was a wound that would not close easily, and that knowing it was not the same as fixing it, but that knowing it was at least a beginning. The rush passed and Caldwell settled again, somewhat changed, more crowded, more connected as the railroads extended. It was becoming a different kind of town. The open Kishom Trail era was ending. The big drives were smaller now. The barbed wire was going up across the cattle country. The long, wild movement of herds up from Texas was gradually giving way to different arrangements, different economics. The town was becoming permanent in a way it had not quite been when it was a drover's town, and the permanence brought schools and churches, and a library society that Gertrude joined with deep pleasure in 1890. She was 45 in 1890, and she was the best version of herself she had ever been. She was aware of this not with smugness but with a clear-eyed gratitude that she had learned slowly was not the same as complacency. She had a life that was full in every dimension, the boarding house and the garden and the library society, and the children and the mornings at the supper table and the evenings in the parlor with Noah, and all the small and large textures of a life shared and built together. Noah had gray at his temples now, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, and she loved his face more than she had the year they married, which she would not have predicted was possible, but which turned out to be simply how it worked. One evening in the autumn of 1890, she was in the parlor with him after the children were in bed. The lamp was between them and the windows were black with October night, and the house was quiet in its deep evening way, and she was reading and he was writing in a journal. He had started a new one the year they married and had filled several since, and she looked across at him without him knowing she was looking, and she thought, there it is. That is a life. That is a whole, real, complete life. And she was moved by it, the way she was moved by the big cottonwoods in the spring, by the meadowlarks on the prairie, by the tremendous, ordinary, gorgeous, unrepeatable fact of being alive and present in a moment that would pass and be gone and would be real forever. Noah looked up and found her watching him and smiled the smile she knew better now than her own reflection. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just looking at you." He looked at her with the same complete attention he had given her from the first, from across a wide Kansas street on a Tuesday in April, the look that had started everything, the look that had never changed, the look that said, "I see you. You are worth seeing, all of it." "I do the same," he said. "When you're not watching." She laughed. "I know," she said. "I've caught you." "Frequently," he agreed. She returned to her book, still smiling, and he returned to his journal, and the lamp burned steadily between them, and the October wind was at the windows, and William and Frances were asleep upstairs, and the boarding house settled around them with its familiar sounds, and outside on Main Street, Caldwell went about its evening business entirely unaware that in the parlor of the house at the west end of Maple Street, something as improbable and simple as perfect happiness was quietly occurring. In the spring of 1891, William Bristol, 5.5 years old, informed his parents at breakfast that he intended to be a scientist when he grew up, because he had found a beetle in the garden that he could not identify, and this had convinced him that the world contained more information than was currently known, and someone needed to attend to it. Noah listened to this with great seriousness and suggested that they write to the land-grant college in Manhattan, Kansas, to inquire what books they might recommend for a young naturalist, which William thought was an excellent plan. Gertrude smiled into her coffee cup and thought that her mother, who had opinions about everything, would have adored this child absolutely. Frances, at 2, was quiet and watchful and extremely determined, and had already demonstrated a capacity to get whatever she wanted by means of strategic patience rather than fuss, which Gertrude recognized as her own method and found alternately alarming and gratifying. She was fond of the garden with the specificity of a child who finds one thing and commits to it entirely, and she could often be found sitting in the dirt between the carrot rows simply observing things, which Gertrude found entirely appropriate. The summer of 1891 was a good summer. The rains came evenly and the garden was extraordinary, and Noah's practice had a quiet period that allowed him to be at home more than usual. And they spent August with the children, the way people spend time when they understand that the specific collection of people in a specific moment will not be assembled again in exactly this configuration. That time moves, and William will not be 5.5 forever. And Frances will not always fit so perfectly in the crook of her father's arm, while he reads to her in the evening. Gertrude took the children to the creek on an afternoon in late August, the same creek where she and Noah had sat in the cottonwood shade the April of the year they met, and she showed William the water striders on the surface, and Frances sat in the shallows with her shoes off, and the meadowlarks were going in the grass, and the cottonwoods made their sound like water in the wind, and she thought about the woman she had been before this life, the woman who had sat on the back step in the moonlight, and asked herself, "Is this the whole of it?" She was glad she had lived long enough to find out it was not. That evening she told Noah about taking the children to the creek, and she told him what she had been thinking, and he listened the way he always listened, with everything he had. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a question he asked her sometimes, not because he doubted the answer, but because he understood that it mattered to say the things out loud that might otherwise go without saying. "Extraordinarily," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "More than I knew was possible for a man who spent 15 years moving from place to place and convincing himself that was sufficient." "Was it insufficient?" she asked. "It was incomplete," he said. "There's a difference. A life can be lived incompletely and still have value, but it was missing something essential." "What was it missing?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. He looked at her with the same direct, unhurried look he had given her from across Main Street on a Tuesday morning in April 1883, the look that had changed everything, that had seen her when no one else had bothered to look. "You," he said, "very specifically and entirely you." She held that for a moment, and then she said, "You know what I think about sometimes." "Tell me." "I think about the fact that you could have gone to the hotel," she said. "The Cattleman's Rest was right there on Main Street. You could have stayed there and never come down Maple Street at all, and I would never have known you existed, and I would have continued to be invisible and thought it was simply the way of things." "I would have come," he said. "I came because of the sign, yes, but I think," he paused, choosing carefully, "I think some things have a way of happening. I don't know how to explain it better than that." "That's not very scientific," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's what I believe." She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, which was something she did with the ease of a person who had been doing it for years and found it no less meaningful for the familiarity, and he turned his head and kissed her properly. And outside the parlor window, the August evening was doing its tremendous sunset work over the Kansas prairie, and the children were asleep upstairs, and the boarding house was quiet and full and real. In the autumn of 1892, Noah took one last case that required extended travel, a complicated matter involving a land fraud scheme that stretched from Wichita to the Oklahoma Territory border, that had been referred to him by 2 county sheriffs and required 3 weeks of careful work to unravel. He was gone for 22 days, which was the longest he had been away since their marriage, and he wrote her a letter every 4 days without fail, the letters arriving slightly out of order by virtue of the postal system's own complicated logic. She kept all of them. When he came home on a cold October evening, William ran to the gate to meet him, and Frances stood in the front doorway with her arms folded in the dignified posture of a 4-year-old, who has decided that running to the gate is beneath her composure, though her face gave everything away. And Gertrude came down the front steps, and he came through the gate, and she went into his arms, and he held her with the same quality of intention he brought to everything, and he said her name against her hair, and she said, "22 days is too long." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't go again for that long," she said. "I won't," he said, and he did not. He resolved after that case to take only local work cases that kept him within a day's ride of Caldwell, that brought him home at night. The practice had enough steady demand within that range to be sustainable, and he was done with long absences. He was a man who had spent 15 years going wherever the work took him, and now the work could come to him, or it could go to someone else. He was a man with reasons to stay, good ones. The years turned. Caldwell grew and changed as Kansas grew and changed, the cattle trail era giving way fully to farming and settlement and railroad expansion, and the town became domestic and established and a little more ordinary, and Gertrude watched it with the same intelligent attention she brought to everything, and noted the changes without mourning the ones that deserved to pass. William, at 12, had accumulated 3 books on natural history, and had organized the beetles he'd found in the garden into a careful collection pressed between pieces of cardboard and labeled in a neat hand. Noah had, true to his word, written to the college in Manhattan, and a professor there had corresponded back with enthusiasm and had recommended additional reading, and had said that when the boy was of age, there was a place for serious students of the natural sciences. Gertrude read this letter 3 times with the kind of pride that she had not known she was capable of until she had something to be proud of. Frances, at 9, was studying Latin. Gertrude had begun teaching her in the evenings, just the 2 of them at the kitchen table with the old Cicero volume that her father had left her, and Frances had taken to it with the focused intensity she brought to everything, working her way through the declensions with the same strategic patience she had demonstrated from the cradle. It was, Gertrude thought, one of the best things she had ever done, passing that strange private knowledge, the thing nobody in Caldwell had known about her for 30 years, to her daughter as something as natural as breathing. When she told Noah that Frances was learning Latin, he said, with the warmth that still made her feel things she had no adequate words for, "Of course she is." In the late autumn of 1895, Gertrude sat in the parlor with Noah on a Sunday evening after church, the children doing their evening tasks in the other room, and she looked around the parlor, the lamp, the books, the 2 chairs that had been in those positions for 12 years, the rag rug she had made herself the winter after they married, the framed photograph of their wedding that Ida Haggerty's son had taken with his newly acquired camera. And she felt the specific peace of a person who has arrived somewhere real. She thought about the Gertrude Kendrick she had been before all of this, the woman with the heavy water buckets and the worn bonnet and the long habit of invisibility, the woman who had made a kind of peace with her solitary life because she did not know how to want something different. She thought about a Tuesday morning in April, and a man on a bay horse riding slowly down Main Street looking at a town he had never seen before. She thought about 2 full breaths of eye contact across the width of a dusty Kansas street. She reached over and took Noah's hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. He turned his hand and held hers without looking up from his reading, the automatic ease of a man for whom this was simply what hands were for, and she felt the warmth of it the same way she had felt it the first time 12 years ago on the front step of this house, not diminished by familiarity, deepened by it, made richer and more essential by every day that had passed since the beginning. "Noah," she said. he said, still reading. "I just wanted to say your name," she said. He looked up from his book and looked at her, and the look was the same one. It had never changed, not in 12 years. Not in all the ordinary and extraordinary days between that April morning and this November evening. Clear and focused and entirely there, entirely hers. "Gertrude," he said in return, because he understood what she meant, and because he was a man who knew the value of saying the things that mattered. The lamp burned between them. The children moved in the next room. The Kansas night was cold and clear outside the windows, and the stars were out in their Kansas abundance, and the boarding house was warm and full of the life she had built, and the love she had found, and the extraordinary, improbable, entirely real fact that she had spent 20 years invisible to every man in Caldwell, and then one stranger had looked at her from across the street, and everything had changed. It had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. She went on holding his hand in the lamplight while the evening deepened around them, and she was not invisible, and she had not been invisible for a long time, and she would never be invisible again, because the man in the chair across from her had eyes that found her every time, across any distance, in any light, without fail. And that was, in the end, the whole of it, the real whole of it. And it was more than she had ever thought to ask for, and it was hers, and she held it with both hands.